I want to welcome you. I'm the Deputy Head of School. I'm Professor Karen McCutcheon. So for those of you who haven't met before, it's lovely to see you here on such a sunshiny evening. You know, it's great to have so many people here. And I have to say, Derek, that your talk received quite a lot of activity. People were, and Gillian can tell, you know, trying to get seats to come along tonight. There's a few empty seats, as you can see, and I think that's probably down to the hot weather, and it's quite unusual in Northern Ireland to get such an evening like this here, but it's certainly people that haven't been able to come along have certainly sent testimonies into the school, because I think, if I'm honest, when I heard Derek McLaughlin, one of our senior lecturers, tell me about EMDR and how he wanted to introduce it into the school, myself and the school manager, Gillian Shannon, who I think is here somewhere, I did see Gillian about, we were skeptical, to say the least, and we thought, how on earth are we going to afford to achieve this, or what's this going to do for the school? But you know, I sat in last year and listened to some testimonies from students that had actually been on Derek's programme, and it moved me, and I thought, you know, this actually has a work. It works for people, not everybody, but it works for people. And if it works for people, well then why shouldn't, you know, why be skeptical? Why have that you know, there? So it changed my mind. It's still very expensive, I have to say, but it did change my mind. It made me think there are other ways and other things that people need to be given the opportunity. So I'm delighted that the school has it in the curriculum now. I'm delighted that the Department of Health continue to commission the programme. I'm delighted that that is happening. I'm delighted that Derek McLaughlin over here is trying to get you know, on board with the full training and being able to deliver that programme as well for Northern Ireland. So I think that's amazing. So we are absolutely thrilled to be here with you this evening as our honorary professor. We are thrilled to have you here to hear what you have, you know, what it's been about, how you've, I actually got a biography here, and I thought, I'm not going to stand and read this, because I'm sure, are you going to big yourself up, Derek, when you start talking, or do I need to stand and read it all? You know, but it's fair to say that you've been, you're significant within, you're well known within this field. You're treating lots of different people, post-trauma, you know, post-traumatic stress, and it's so important and vital that continues. And we are really impressed with the work that you do, and not just the mental health team will look forward to working with you. The whole school will look forward to working more with you, and don't worry, there's a lot of work that we, as a school, we're such a big school that there's so much activity going on. We won't overwork you, but we are delighted to have you on board, and we look forward to many more sessions and hearing more about the work that you do. I think, as I say, there is food. There's lots of people here, guests who, you know, we've got colleagues from the university, PhD students here. I see staff, I see service users and carers here. I see lots of mental health team and external practice partners, different people from all avenues of life. And it's lovely to see you, and lovely to see some of your family members here as well. And I think you've all been in Northern Ireland before, but just in case you haven't, this weather is always here with us. We always have beautiful weather like this. It's quite unusual, but you know, I don't think I will go on any further other than to introduce you, Derek, and let you take the stage and talk us through your EMDR successes. Thank you.
Colleagues, first and foremost, thank you very, very much. In terms of, I feel very honoured that Queen's has sort of created this opportunity, you know, in that sense, and so I want to thank sort of Queen's University Belfast. Particularly want to thank my family. It's not easy for my wife being married to a trauma therapist, as many of you know. Want to thank my daughter and my son. My daughter for representing Liverpool, and my son who's flown all the way from New Zealand, really. So, you know, so that's very, very appreciative. But I also want to thank you in terms of for spending your Thursday night sort of, you know, here on a sunny day, and I can see very, very few times when the weather has been this good here, you know, in that sense. And so yeah, it is wonderful to be here in such sort of wonderful, wonderful weather, really, in that sense. As a trauma therapist, just in terms of an opening sort of context, I also want to thank Queen's University for allowing me the opportunity to present the 360 slides that I want to go through, you know, in that sense. And so they have said as long as I finish by 10:30, we should be okay, really, in that sense. But I'm joking. It's not 330 slides. It's 275. But I first came to Northern Ireland in the 90s. And I don't mind admitting that the first time that I arrived at Aldergrove Airport, I was really quite anxious and apprehensive. And so I got into the taxi and they got talking to the driver, and he'd asked me, obviously, had I been to Belfast and Northern Ireland. I said I hadn't. And he said, well, let me give you three pieces of advice. He said, there's three subjects never to talk about. Never to talk about. And he said, and if you don't talk about those three things, you should be fine. He said, the first one is don't talk about religion. Don't talk about religion. He said, don't talk about politics, and don't talk about football. Anyway, tonight I'm going to talk about religion, I'm going to talk about politics, and I'm also going to talk about football, you know, in that sense. I want to sort of explain sort of the rationale for that, really, in that sense. The reason why I sort of show sort of this slide, really, it's a very strange slide in terms of the fact that sort of those of you that are familiar with statistics, it sort of looks like a bit of a linear regression, you know, in terms of, why does it start off hovering over the United Kingdom and then sort of beautifully sort of, works its way down to New Zealand. But these are all of the trauma capacity building projects that I've been involved in, since the mid-90s. And actually, it's very interesting the fact that actually the very first one actually started here in Northern Ireland in around about 1996, 1997, which is when we brought a specific trauma therapy, into the province, in that sense. And it was interesting getting a sense of the introduction in terms of EMDR seeming sort of very, very strange, which I think we can never ever get away from, in that sense. But what was particularly interesting when we go back to the mid-1990s is the fact that we were teaching this stuff when the research evidence base was not that strong, was not that great, and so it did seem very, very peculiar, in that sense. And one of the things that I was always then very, very struck about was how could we take this therapy and go in two different directions. The first one is about how can we use it in relation to trauma capacity building. And so you'll see a lot of the activities that have sort of spent quite a lot of time in the Middle East, really focusing around sort of Iraq and Lebanon and Palestine and southern Turkey. And then more latterly, in terms of some of the later projects over in Southeast Asia. And as you'll see a bit later on, that these are often trauma capacity building projects that are usually as a consequence of things that human beings have done to other human beings. And what we do know is the fact that actually that the prevalence of that is increasing and not decreasing. The second aspect of this is that trauma capacity building projects often come about as a consequence of acts of nature. And so one of the reasons why so many projects have taken place in Southeast Asia is because that part of the world has the most natural disasters. And so the one that took place in 2004 was the Indian Ocean tsunami, which actually caused sort of, huge amounts of devastation. And so, it was 3 tsunami waves that actually sort of took place round about here. But actually the tsunami wave didn't just devastate this whole region here, but actually sort of hit the coastline of Africa at the same time. So trauma capacity building has always been very, very significant. The second bit, and something I have been working on since the early 2000s, is about how can we move EMDR therapy into academic institutions? How can we move it into university programs? And that's been just as much of an extraordinary challenge. And so that's why it's also great to have the opportunity of working with sort of Derek Mack about how can we get that sort of entrenched here in within Queen's. But what I want to really focus on for the purpose of this talk is looking at the distinction between trauma and moral injury, and the ways in which they overlap, and the ways in which they they differ. And therefore, understandably, if things differ, then that has significant implications with regards to treatment intervention. The other thing to emphasize is the fact that when we're working with vulnerable populations, we also have to accept the fact that we meet clients that actually change our lives, fundamentally change our lives by the nature of their lived experience. There was one particular woman who I met in the early 1990s that probably has had the most dramatic impact on my career as a mental health worker, because this was a 33-year-old woman who had been sexually assaulted by an Anglican priest. Now this is 1990. I remember hearing this woman's story and just being completely and utterly horrified by the nature of experience, but how that just seemed to go. I'd not really came across that as a narrative before. Now, what was interesting about the case is the fact that this woman had also been abused by the same priest when she was a child. And so one of the things that she described back in 1990 is something that we would now describe as a trauma memory. And it was a very, very clear memory of a horrific event that happened when she was 11 years of age. And she remembered verbatim the silencing strategy that the priest used in order to sort of to silence her, really. And this was what she said. This is our secret. You mustn't tell anybody. Secrets can never be broken. However, if you do tell anyone, then God will know what you've done. Because I'm a priest, God will inform me of your deed, and therefore you'll need to be punished. And basically, if you tell anybody, I will kill you. Now, as an 11-year-old trauma survivor, of course she's going to believe that. Of course she's going to believe that. And although there are many horrific things that came from that, one of the things that really struck me was the part God played in that. Where was God in that scenario? In that sense, because the way in which the priest is presenting the narrative is in a highly collusive way. And so this is why what I'm trying to sort of explore is the fact that actually trauma only captures some of this landscape. Is the fact that there are other moral, theological, spiritual dimensions that become really, really quite critical within this. Now, just to give you a bit of a context of this, one of the reasons why the abuse stopped when she was a young girl is because she eventually told her parents, and her parents believed what had gone on. They were devout Anglicans. What they then did is that they went to the local bishop. The bishop also believed, and the bishop said that he would sort it. he would arrange it. So they went home. They were then expecting a call from the local police. That never happened. What they then found out a couple of weeks later is that the bishop did sort it, and that he actually moved this priest to an orphanage in Africa, where he spent the next 20 years working with young vulnerable populations, in that sense. Now, the thing is the fact that, after 20 years, he then applied to then come back to the UK. He was then allowed back, and within 3 days, he'd actually hunted down this woman and sort of assaulted her. But the trauma bits are distinct in terms of the fact that there was lots of elements of intrusivity, lots of elements of hyperarousal, lots of emotional regulation and relational issues. But some of the distinctness about her experiences is about her relationship with God, her relationship with spirituality, her relationship with her part of how she viewed herself within the wider sort of cosmos. And this is also emphasized by another client that I worked with, who again had a very profound impact. And this was a survivor of abuse by a Roman Catholic priest. And this was the question that she put to me. And at the time, I didn't know how to answer it. But she says, before my perpetrator dies, what if he seeks forgiveness and repents for his sins? What would God do? If you believe that God is a truly forgiving God, and they believed in the authenticity of confession, then God would forgive. Upon my perpetrator's death, he would then be allowed into heaven. And if this happens, then heaven is now no longer safe. And therefore, where do I go? Where do I go? So this is why I'm saying is the fact that actually trauma only captures part of this. Is that there are other dimensions that we have to sort of think about. Now, third example I want to give you is experience that happened more recently. This is about 3 years ago. You're familiar with ISIS. They set up a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. But what people sort of may not be aware of is the fact that ISIS also set up a second caliphate in the Philippines, where they took over parts of Marawi. And we were part of a team that was initially commissioned by the World Bank to go into the city to really do a trauma assessment to work out, what was actually sort of needed in terms of to try to address the mental health needs. And one of the people that we met when we were in the Philippines was a Roman Catholic priest who had been captured by ISIS and had actually been held hostage for around about 116 days. And now the whole city had been completely and utterly destroyed, in terms of trying to defeat ISIS in that sense. But when I first met Father Chito, he had been rescued by Philippine special forces and was actually sort of airlifted out of the city, was then taken to Manila, where he received a hero's welcome, complete hero, because this was a great symbolism in terms of that this priest was rescued from the hands of ISIS, but he'd never been back to the city. And one of the things that he asked is whether I would take him back. Now, this was the war was still on, and so we were able to arrange with the Philippine military for a full military escort to take us back into the city. ISIS you know, whenever they leave an area, they always booby trap it, and so it was a very dangerous environment sort of to go into. So we had a full military convoy taking this priest back to the cathedral, really, in that sense. And when we got into the church, the cathedral had just been completely and utterly devastated. Had just been completely desecrated, type of thing. And he was very, very distressed by seeing the abuse, and so when we were coming away from it and we were driving through villages, he was literally treated like a rock star, because this, as I say, this was great symbolism in terms of the fact that this man this man had been survived and saved, really, in that sense. And at the end of the day, again, I was very blessed and fortunate to do a debrief with him, which lasted about 3.5 hours. And one of the things that he said during this debrief is something he'd never told anybody before, and it was this. He said, there were days and days of bombings. Sometimes the noise was deafening. I'd spent endless days in the dark, night and day indistinguishable. I've never shared this with anybody, but I had moments when I thought about ending my life. I feel deep shame in my having had these thoughts. I've let my God down, I've let my vows as a priest down, and I've let my flock down. And so again, the point I'm making is the fact that just looking at this within the realms of PTSD and complex PTSD doesn't capture it. It doesn't sort of fit the nature of his anguish and the nature of his lived experiences. And then the fourth example I want to give is another controversial case, but it's about an Australian cardinal called Cardinal Pell, who in March 2019, he was sentenced to imprisonment for abuse against minors. And one of the things that was really quite extraordinary is the fact that he was incarcerated for over 400 days, and the Vatican also kept him as a cardinal. So he's the only person to have ever been incarcerated, but keep his role, you know, in that sense. And one of the famous statements that he made, because although he was facing these specific charges about sexual abuse of minors, one of the other criticisms he faced is the fact that he'd actually covered up decades of abuse within the Roman Catholic Church within Australia. And during an interview on Australia media, he very famously said, if you have a truck driver who picks up a woman at the side of the street and subsequently sexually assaults her, then why should you sue the haulage company? And his viewpoint was, well, if a priest sexually abuses a minor, why should you sue the Roman Catholic Church? In that sense. And so now the reason why I'm mentioning these is because you know it as well as I do, that those of you that work with clients going through this journey, is just how extraordinarily difficult and challenging it is from the victim's perspective. And we know that there are so many things that can go wrong, in that sense. But Pell was eventually acquitted, and he was acquitted really on a technicality. Acquitted on a technicality, and actually, even though Pell is now now died last year, the legal proceedings are still going on, and so we know that this is a very difficult, very, very sensitive issue, but we also know the fact that actually the first time the Roman Catholic Church ever legislated for abuse within its clergy was actually in the 2nd century. It was actually in the 2nd century. So we know it's not a new problem. So the thing is the fact that when we look at it from a trauma perspective, we know that the memories of survivors in terms of all four of these narratives, would fit into this pathway of pathogenic memories. So pathogenic memories, as you know, are memories that are formulated differently. They're constructed differently. They have often higher levels of vividness. They have higher levels of negative believability. They have higher levels of emotionality, and they also have lots of somatic echoes and reference points to them. And we also know that characterologically that they're very different from ordinary narrative memories. But these are what clients often sort of come to see us for. But these pathogenic memories, and these are not unique to PTSD, and they're not unique to complex PTSD, you know this, but they often fit into these four characteristics. You often have attachment traumas, which are really traumas that are based on experiences that they were never there. They were never there, either through insecurity with maternal relationships, paternal relationships, sort of grandparental relationships in that sense. And so this is where, you know, we get this concept of insecurity here. Loss traumas are based on attachments that were there that are now no longer not there. So like the death of a loved one, the death of a pet, the death of a, you know, a passing insult. And then you've got this third one here, which is about adversity. Then you've got this fourth one here, which is about relationships, or the absence of relationships, particularly around, you know, lack of authenticity. And so one of the things that we often do as clinicians is, you know, we tend to focus on, you know, using this analogy of the tree in terms of what's above ground. What's above ground? But what about what is going on underneath the ground in terms of the root systems? You know, one of the things I love about this room is about this painting. This painting above is simply stunning, but it represents female empowerment, you know, in that sense. And so I was asking about the history of it, but this is a testimony of female professionals here at Queen's University Belfast, and it's an amazing picture. But it's also an interesting picture because even though here we are 2023, we acknowledge in terms of the fact that there are significant inequalities between men and women. You know, why do women have to work so much harder at their career than men do? You know, so there is something about the fact that actually the trauma is not just about the nature of people's experiences, it's also something that's fundamentally structural. There's also something about the fact that actually, you know, we seem to be living in a world where actually the differences between what people have and what people don't have is actually becoming more and more significant. It's actually becoming more and more sort of entrenched, really, in that sense. And this is why, you know, I want to add this notion about, you know, if we look at sort of what's existing here within the root systems, you'll see that some of these characteristics that are actually sort of going on here around shame, around fear, around secrecy, and around culture. So an example would be, you know, we often tell people, well, you know, take a comprehensive history from your clients, you know, and thinking, well, how much of your history would you be willing to disclose to people? Because you probably won't. You probably won't. People always hold things back. And usually because that's fear-based, or that's because there are some elements of shame or guilt that's actually sort of involved in that, really, in that sense. You don't need somebody like me to come into a place like Northern Ireland to say that, you know, this is a culture of re-traumatization, you know, of where people who have experienced, you know, one particular layer of traumas and maybe have gone through some form of system in order to try and get some sort of retribution or acknowledgement and validation, and that has ended up being a completely re-traumatizing experience. You know, you know as well as I that the conviction rate for rape within the United Kingdom is less than 3%. You know, that's shocking. That is shocking. But so it's something about the fact that, well, where do we then sit with all of this stuff in relation to sort of, moral injustice and moral trauma? So when we're talking about these moral injuries, these are often experiences where there is some form of violation of deeply held views. And as you saw in some of the examples I said before, they can be very emotional, they can be very spiritual, they can be very existential in their orientation. They can also be based on loss of trust. When systems or individuals don't function in the way that we did. We saw that a lot through the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was lots of systemic failures in terms of, around PPE equipment, in terms of systems and procedures. It can often involve a sense of meaningless. The example of what Father Chito was talking about, he was trying to, when he was talking about this sense of being a fraud, recognized as a rock star on one hand, and yet on the other hand, feeling as if he'd actually let down God, let down his community. But what's also interesting is the fact that with these experiences here, these are not explained by our current understanding of PTSD. And what the research really shows is the fact that if we just treat the PTSD, it doesn't address the moral injury. And interestingly, what the research shows is that the opposite is also true. If you just address the moral injury, is the fact that what it doesn't do, it doesn't address the PTSD. And so actually what you need is a combination, a combination of the two. So when we look at, in terms of thinking in terms of interventions, in terms of how we need to move forward with the nature of these experiences, particularly in relation to EMDR. What I'm saying as a clinician is the fact that we have to deal with both the PTSD element and the moral injury bit. I'm not going to bore you with the research, but we just finished a randomized control trial last year where we were able to show that group EMDR was effective for PTSD and complex PTSD, but was not effective in the treatment of moral injury. In that sense, and there was something about the fact that actually the group intervention didn't really allow the opportunity to really explore any of these issues in any great depth or any great sort of understanding, really. And that's why if we look at some of the principles of why therapy works, and we talk about the fact that, well, clients need explanations in order to account for their symptoms and their experiences. That needs to be given to them in a completely bespoke way. But the third bit is the fact that it's about not getting away from the importance of the relationship that you actually have with your client. And one of the things that you'll see here, which links in with where I'm wanting to go with this, is around this concept of why compassion is so critical. And you'll see there that term detached compassion. The reason why detached compassion is so critical is because if you weren't able to detach from those relationships, you just leave yourself open to burnout. You just end up sort of, being sort of completely and utterly fatigued by that particular sort of process, really. It's only the fourth one that then talks about the treatment rationale. One of the criticisms I have about EMDR as a therapy is that we spend so long teaching people the protocol, and yet we spend very little time teaching people about how to develop a compassionate relationship. And yet, with regards to the issues that we're talking about, this becomes really quite critical and really quite sort of significant, really. The other bit, I'm not going to go too much down this rabbit hole, but we get very used to using this language of PTSD and complex PTSD, but lots of our clients don't like this language. It doesn't fit them, and so some of the transdiagnostic, method, languages that we use are around things like the absence of power, the absence of security, and the absence of love. And those of you that are working clinically, my guess is you can probably think of virtually every single client that's on your caseload and thinking that actually one of the reasons why they're sitting in your office is either because they don't feel powerful, they don't feel secure, and they don't feel loved, irrespective of a fancy diagnosis of complex PTSD, you know, in that sense. And so we know EMDR is an effective intervention for this. We know it's empirically supported. It's a transdiagnostic treatment, because if you go back to the trauma tree that I showed you before, pathogenic memories, as you know, are not unique to PTSD. They exist in a whole range of different sort of lived experiences. It uses this very strange process of bifocal dual attention stimulation, which, you know, a Martian coming down to the world and looking at an EMDR session and sees somebody doing this in front of your face, then yeah, that looks weird. Of course it looks weird. But again, what you're saying to the client is the fact that this is not therapy. This is just doing something that is naturally that is naturally sort of, you know, part of our information processing system. We know it's multimodal. We also know that it can be EMDR can be the most simple, straightforward therapy on one hand, and can be the most complicated, frustrating, exasperating therapy on the other, you know, in that sense. And that's because the nature of lived experiences is challenging. But one of the reasons why it works comes down to the science of neuroplasticity. Is the fact that the brain's ability to be able to forge new links, to forge new sort of connections, really, and that in itself is not a metaphorical model. It's a physical model. Now, one of the criticisms I would say about where I think EMDR is going at the moment links in with something I'm going to talk about a bit later on, but a very interesting person called Ian McGilchrist, who wrote an exceptional book called, you know, The Master and His Emissary. And he talks about the fact that actually our world is becoming increasingly left hemisphere focused. And EMDR, in some respects, is going down a similar rabbit hole in terms of thinking about, well, just do this. Just do flash technique. Just do, just do flash forward. Just do, increase working memory taxation devices in that sense. But if we look at McGilchrist's argument, these are all left hemisphere solutions, often to problems that are actually not generated by the left hemisphere. They're actually generated by the right hemisphere. And again, I'll say a little bit more about this really in that sense. So McGilchrist spent many years, decades, actually investigating the lived experiences of patients who have had strokes. And so he was able to then do a comparison between what patients were able to do before the stroke and what they couldn't do after the stroke. And he was able to, obviously then had an understanding in terms of where the traumatic brain injury was then being able to get some form of delineation between, left hemisphere functioning and right hemisphere functioning. And when it comes to things like morality, moral trauma, this then becomes interesting. I'm saying that and I'm sad and I need to get out in all sorts of way, but moral judgments are actually informed by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is actually quite antisocial, but it's your right hemisphere that is actually more social. It's the right hemisphere that is able to make a distinction between what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so assessing the morality of actions, moral reasoning, and promoting pro-social norms depends on a fully functioning right hemisphere. So the point I'm making is the fact that if we're just doing trauma interventions that are just left hemisphere focused, you start to then miss out some of these critical aspects of a lived experience. The right hemisphere is actually really important for mediating empathy and compassion. So the difference between empathy and compassion, so empathy is a felt state, but compassion is a motivated state. So the empathy is you've got to feel it, but the compassion is you've got to feel it to then do something with it. The left hemisphere is more involved in antisocial emotions. For example, when people start to gloat, or when people start to then justify, why that, some of the crimes and abhorrent activities that they have done. And so when you have these unpleasant moral issues, when they get triggered, actually what you see is the fact that these get activated much more in the right hemisphere than in the left hemisphere. If we want to get a better sense of fairness from clients' lived experience, particularly from the victim narrative's perspective, then this is actually underwritten by the right hemisphere. Okay, the right hemisphere also plays a part in actually things like called altruistic sort of punishment. The right hemisphere actually is really important for moral judgment making and sort of making a distinction between different types of intent. And so these normal moral judgments, to look at moral judgments in the round, you need the vital resources of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So this is why it's coming back to this notion about the fact that actually it's not just about seeking a left hemisphere solution to something that is right hemisphere. So I mentioned, how does this then relate to football? Okay, and so in terms of the example that I want to give you in terms of the fact that why it's not just about the pathogenic experience, it's about looking at the broader sort of aspects of this. So if we look at the Hillsborough disaster, again, Hillsborough disaster is a very personal trauma for me, not just because I'm from Liverpool, and I apologise, I am a Liverpool fan. I know there are some Chelsea fans in the audience, but Chelsea fans usually, that's another form of mental illness that they're thinking about putting in DSM-6. But the other reason why Hillsborough is really important is because of my brother is also a survivor of Hillsborough. So my brother was at the ground on that day. And even though that happened on the 15th of April, 1989, my elder brother has still never talked about this. He's still never talked about it. In fact, he would say he finds it a complete and utter pain in the ass that he has a brother who's a trauma psychologist who specializes in the Hillsborough disaster, but he has no intention of ever talking about it, in that sense. And so, but again, I'm not going to go into too much details about the Hillsborough disaster, but I just want to sort of get to this bit, which is the fact that, just to point out here, the current status is that from the Hillsborough disaster, 97 people lost their life. So 97 people went to a football match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest and never came home. And over 700 were severely injured. And I mean life-threatening, a sort of life-changing sort of injuries, in that sense. Now, again, you know this from your experiences of the lived experience here in Northern Ireland. But the reason why this is important is because the state actually intervened right from the very beginning. And so, within hours, police statements, police notebooks were being changed. Pages were being ripped out. Radio narratives were being changed by the British government at the time. Media reporting, was impacted. And so 2 days after Hillsborough, the Sun newspaper started to talk about Liverpool fans being tanked up jobs and that they stole from the dead, or that they urinated over brave cops. Here we are, 30 odd years later, there's never been any proof of this. But it's something about how the state itself wanted to control this trauma narrative. And so, so South Yorkshire Police, instructed 164 police officers to edit their police statements, to emphasize the fact that actually it was Liverpool football fans who were drunk. It was Liverpool football fans who were ticketless, and all the violence was actually perpetrated by LFC fans. The Sun newspaper started to run Sheffield, character of loads of money, you know, really sort of criticising Scousers, really sort of demonising. You had Sir Bernard Ingram, who was Margaret Thatcher's press secretary. He said there would not have been the Hillsborough disaster if tanked up yobs had not turned up in very large numbers to try and force their way into the ground, you know. And then he also repeated back in 1996 that Liverpool should just shut up about Hillsborough. Okay. Again, I won't go into sort of the chaos of this, but you know, there was the inquest that then took place in 2016, which actually found that there was a breach in duty of care. The jury concluded that the errors were by South Yorkshire Police, failures by the commanding officers, defects with the stadium, but at no point was blame actually then attributed towards Liverpool football fans. But the simple reality is that, and here we are now, you know, here we are now in 2023, but to date there have been no prosecutions, despite, you know, sort of 97 deaths and 700 people's lives fundamentally sort of, you know, changed as a consequence of it, really, in that sense. And the reason why I think this then becomes important is because the trauma process itself creates a moral challenge. It creates a moral challenge. And the reason why is because if you look at the individual response or the community response, is the fact that it's often based on survival, it's often based on shock, or it's based on lots of anger and outrage at the loss of loved ones. Many of the Liverpool players, for example, went to every single funeral. If you just think about the human experience of that as an elite athlete, actually sort of being exposed to that level of traumatization, you know, and there was a lot of talk around about revenge and retribution. There was, there were lots of answers in search of meaning, lots of grief, lots of resolutions, but the Sun newspaper is still unofficially banned in Liverpool. Very hard to buy the Sun newspaper. You know, a lot of Liverpool community, not just Liverpool fans, but Everton fans as well, shifted their allegiance towards the Daily Mirror. It's very interesting that when you then look at Brexit and you think, well, actually, Liverpool was one of the cities that actually voted the most to remain within the European Union because it was not influenced by a lot of the right-wing sort of media that often comes out of England, really, in that sense. But the point that I'm making is the fact that if you look at these are all the symptoms that we see within our clinical rooms with clients. But when you then look at the political systems, the political system is often the exact opposite. You see this here in Northern Ireland. You've got loads of examples here in Northern Ireland where you see the same thing, where it all becomes about crisis management. It all becomes about controlling the narrative. It's a cognitive decision-making process. It's not an emotional one. It's about truth as opposed to justice. You know, it's about obfuscation. You know, we're seeing exactly the same thing with the COVID inquiry within the United Kingdom at the moment. It's all about obfuscation. The fact that Sweden has already done its COVID inquiry, it's done and dusted, it's already got its recommendations, but the UK is deliberating exactly the part of this moral challenge. And the other thing about political systems is the fact that they work to a very different timetable. Those of you that lost loved ones in the COVID-19 pandemic, people want answers now, but actually we're still years away from getting those answers. This is a deliberate sort of stance that's actually sort of, taken really in that sense. And so the thing is that potential for re-traumatization that becomes really high, and the potential for a greater good therefore becomes really then sort of quite challenged, because it then just becomes a very, very sort of managed manage sort of decline really in that sense. So if we then come back then to the interventions that we need to use, we can't just focus on the bits that's above the ground, the trunk and the tree. We've got to focus on, you know, on the root systems, and we've got to focus on sort of, you know, what makes the tree grow. You know, what are the nutrients that are actually sort of in the soil that's actually sort of, you know, contributing to that. So when we look at these 4 principles then of the interventions that we use, which is then often based around psychoeducation, which is about giving people information in order to make sense of their lived experience, about how they can regulate their own physiology, their own emotions, the trauma confrontation bit, which is from the EMDR bit, phases 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you've got this reinvention and this resilience bit. So if we take these, and these are all sort of really sort of empirically supported in the treatment that we offer, but what about these systems? What about forgiveness? What about compassion? What about atonement? What about redemption? You know, and what about grace? So it's about how can we then incorporate these into our systems? Because we know that if you're a survivor of child abuse and you decide you decide to prosecute your perpetrator, we know as clinicians that's much more likely to go wrong than it is to go right. We know that. That's a moral challenge for us, because we know we're trying to support and promote and empower people going into a system that is almost rigged against them. We know that. We know that because we have decades of experience of it in terms of working with clients. So this is not, it's not something that we can ignore. We're not just working with trauma in an isolation chamber. We're working with trauma within a moral context, within a broader political and community sort of context in that, in that sense. And so one of the reasons why I think EMDR needs to become, in my humble opinion, more compassion focused is because it's about acknowledging the fact that there are a number of interesting models and frameworks and ideas that actually sort of come together in a very interesting sort of synergist sort of way, which sort of links together some of the points that I'm making here. So you've got obviously the person on the left-hand side, you've got Francine Shapiro, the developer of EMDR therapy. You've got Ian McGilchrist here. You've got Gabor Mate, who's sort of developing some very interesting ideas around compassion, compassionate sort of inquiry. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a moment. Then you've got this other individual here, which is Paul Gilbert, who very much from the CBT sort of community, but developed more sort of compassion-focused interventions, really underpinned by what we know from evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology. So on one hand, we have the adaptive information processing model, which really sort of links in with neuroplasticity and the ability for the brain to rewire itself. And this is a very, very, very powerful model. But we also know that some of the things that we learn is not helpful. It's not always helpful, in that sense. And let me give you an example. And I'll use my wife as a good example. I can give my wife 99 true compliments, and I can give her 1/2 criticism, which is one she remembers. Okay, now that's not unique to my wife, because we all do it. We all do it, in that sense. And the reason why is because our brains are programmed to hear emotional messages more strongly. So this is why the negatives resonate in terms of the way, in the way that, now what Paul Gilbert talks about, which is about that these are faults. These are information processing faults. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that actually sometimes we get things wrong, sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we acknowledge the fact that we make errors. We make interpretation sort of errors in that sense. And so, when we're talking about then how are some of the ways in which we can make EMDR more compassionate. One of the things that Gabor Mate says in compassionate inquiry is the fact that what we should always do with our client is we should always put the mirror up to their face and reflect back what they see. Okay, we know that that is a very sort of rich approach that's used within the humanistic sort of paradigm. But what Mate also talks about is the fact that, but if we do that with our clients, we should always do that with ourselves. We should also look into our own mirror, particularly because it's part of this notion about the fact that trauma isn't something that happens to them. Trauma is something that actually happens to all of us. So it's part of that. It's part of that community, that common sense of humanity. That sort of like that goes with that. The second part that really links in with what Gabor Mate talks about and what Paul Gilbert talks about is about the importance of bearing witness. You'll see in a sort of a slide or two, is that one of the areas that often comes up within EMDR is the fact that people see it as a very active intervention. You should be sort of, you're the expert focusing on the trauma memories, but actually it's more, there are times when actually people just need to bear their story. They just need to tell you what they've gone through. And sometimes the best things that we can do at that moment is just shut up. Just listen. Just bear witness to it. Do the simple things well. Just notice that shared experience, or maybe the awfulness of this, or the sadness, or the sorrow of the nature of that experience. Often people with an EMDR feel like they've got to keep going, they've got to keep moving it, they've got to keep sort of get the sud down, get the sud down. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just about acknowledging the power of that lived experience. The second one is this balance that we talked about. We've got this AIP model, which is very positive, which very much fits into this concept of neuroplasticity, but we've also got this evolutionary biological one about the notion about the fact that actually what we also think is not always correct. We like to think of ourselves as empirical, human beings, but we make mistakes, we make errors. And therefore, this is why, compassion becomes, in order to forgive others, we have to find ways of actually forgiving ourselves and embracing our own sort of humanness that goes with that, really, in that sense. The third bit alludes to what we were saying before. It's about normalizing non-disclosure. We keep talking about this notion about comprehensive history, but there's a mythology to that. We want to try and get as much information as we possibly can, but at the same time, we also acknowledge in terms of the fact that there will be lots of reasons that people don't want to tell us things. And we've done several research projects now, sort of looking at different ways in which we can adapt EMDR for working with some of those memories. This is one of the big advantages EMDR actually has, is it's possible to actually work with a memory without the client actually disclosing what that memory is. Very hard to do that in prolonged exposure. Very hard to do that. One of the reasons why I think EMDR is not effective in group interventions for moral injury is because you don't have the same level of robust case conceptualization that you do get in sort of individual sort of work, really, in that sense. But the green bar there, the green one, is very much about the fact that it's about being more open about the moral landscape. Some of them, because the point that I started off with is by saying the fact that, look, trauma only captures some of this, but actually some of these moral dimensions also sort of, give other sort of insights into the landscape, and therefore we need to capture those and we need to understand those in terms of the client's sort of lived experience, really, in that sense. Another interesting thing that's happening within the trauma field not just within EMDR, because the same thing is also happening within prolonged exposure, is don't worry about trauma regulation. Just go straight into working with the memories, you know, in that sense. But actually, trauma regulation is really critical, because if we take this model of the past, the present, and the future, we know that often what gets squeezed out is the present. And so getting people to be more in touch with who they are as individuals, more in touch with the present, more in touch with the sort of their connection with you know, with the here and now becomes really, really sort of quite critical. In terms of other bits, it again, particularly from an EMDR focus, is about the interweaves that we use. The interweaves that we use in terms of the fact that the interweaves themselves also need to be fundamentally focused around sort of the aspects of moral injury, including things like sort of spiritual empowerment. And one of the things that, again, coming back to Gabor Mate, he talks about the fact that often a lot of the problems people have around the absence of power and the absence of love and the absence of security is based around a lack of authenticity. You know, in that sense. And so it's about looking at how can a person live a life that is more authentic to the self, it's more authentic to the relationships that they're actually sort of involved in, and that it actually fits in with the broader cosmos, however people want to define sort of cosmos really in that sense. The blue column there is this notion about the fact that actually we are living in a world that is a lot more uncertain. Again, I'd be very interested in your viewpoint on this, but one of the thoughts I've been struggling with post-COVID is that the world seems an awful lot more unkind than it was before COVID. You know, and we see this within our own communities. You know, it's like some of that dissonance, some of that anguish has still got a sort of play itself out really in that sense. What I've also highlighted is this notion about political anger. This notion, again, I'm not going to say too much about that because you're more expert about this than I am, really in that sense, in terms of the lived experience of here in Northern Ireland. But we do need to address the elephant in the room, and that is the fact that we are living in a fundamentally changing world, where the moral landscape is fundamentally changing. You know, you've only got to look at the polarity that's happening within the United States as an example, you know, as an example of this, really, in that sense. And so, are we living in a more compassionate deficit world? And you'll see another word there. Ooh. One of the things I'm often asked about is of somebody who's been in war zones. Somebody's been in major disaster areas, you know, has witnessed firsthand some of the terrible, terrible things that human beings do to other people. And, you know, people often say, well, is it worth it? Is it worth it? And the answer I always give is the fact that, yes, it is always worth it. Because whenever you go into these environments, you also see something really quite incredible. You also see what we're capable of doing when we're actually able to be more compassionate. And I want to just leave you with one story of an incident that happened to me when I was in Pakistan, in the devastating earthquakes that happened there in 2005. And I was up in a village quite close to the Afghanistan border, and the level of devastation was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. And I just spent some time with a junior doctor that worked in he was operating out of a porter cabin. And his job, he was working for the World Health Organization, and he was seeing 120 patients a morning. 120 patients a morning, you know, in that sense. And in the afternoon, he was having to see another 120, you know, just demand completely and outstrip supply. And I took a walk out of the village because I was just feeling sort of completely and utterly sort of deflated about, just felt so overwhelming. It just felt so, yeah, just literally overwhelming is the word really in that sense. And so, and just sort of found myself sitting at the side of the road thinking, what the hell am I doing here? You know, that it seems pointless me being here. It seems, what we're trying to do. And you know, when you get that sense of somebody's watching you, and I just looked up, and there was a guy who was just standing on the other side of the road, type of thing. Really, just sort of looking at me, you know, and he couldn't speak English. I couldn't speak Urdu. He just smiled, and he just said. So I got up and went with him. Took me to his shack. I wasn't thinking, you know, oh my God, this could be that he could be out to kill me. You know, he could be working for da da da. It was just, it felt the right thing to do. Okay, he beckoned me to sit down. I sat down, and he went and made a cup of tea. He hardly had anything in the shack. And so he made this black tea. He offered to put some sugar in it, and we literally just sat there. I couldn't speak to him. He couldn't speak to me. We just sat there. We just shared about 10, 12 minutes over a cup of tea. And then when I'd finished it, I gave him the cup back and thanked him and left, and then went back to work. There was nothing said. There was nothing clever. There was nothing other than how sometimes the best things is to just do the simple things well. And just to have that moment of a compassionate human connection just made me think about, yeah, that's the way forward. Colleagues, I hope that was useful. But listen, thank you very, very much for sharing your Thursday evening with me. But thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much.
Very, very thought-provoking, and do you feel that moral injury of being a Chelsea fan? We have a wee minute or two before I have some more refreshments. Any questions for Derek? I was told to give you a really hard question by Alistair Black, but I said.
Yeah, if it's hard, Paul Miller will answer that one. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, Mum.
Professor Farrell, can you just explain a wee bit more on the concept of pathogenic memories?
Yeah, well, pathogenic memory is a technical term, really. I guess the more ubiquitous language is just to describe it as a trauma memory, but it's a trauma memory that, in a way, is influenced more by the amygdala, by the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, rather than the cognitive sort of prefrontal cortex, really, in that sense. And so it often memories that can be very vivid. They can be have very high levels of emotionality sort of attached to them. They're often felt, in that sense. But what they also do is they distort the way in which we make sense of the experience, not just in terms of the meaning and the attributes that we give to it, but also in terms of the way in which we validate ourselves. And so often that creates a very self-critical, very irrational sort of defeating sort of narrative that sort of goes with it, really. But that would be the characteristics of a pathogenic memory. But often the language we use for clients, we describe these as just trauma memory. So a memory that when you activate it, it has a visceral component, has a reaction to it. Does that answer it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark.
Hi, thank you, that was all fascinating. In the 21st century, parents expect a pregnancy to go well and to produce a happy, healthy baby at the end of it.
Yeah.
Where that doesn't happen, where a baby's born prematurely or sick or with a congenital anomaly, parents obviously will often spend a lot of time in the NICU unit, and that feels like a moral injury. Like there's a, as you said, a force working against you, like something bad has happened.
Yeah.
To use EMDR as a first aid intervention for those parents, is it going to be strong enough to block the sort of memories that you were talking about being taken out of that unit or being taken into the future of not only those parents but the child?
Well, that's a fascinating question. There's a lot of complexity in that, in that sense. But I think the first bit is the fact that there is a lived experience expectation that people are going to get pregnant and going to have a healthy, functioning baby. And so there is something about, and of course on one level we all want that. We all want that. But what we also know, and again, I know it's very easy to say this, but there is something about the unpredictability of life, the unpredictability of the fact that there are elements of randomness, which can often result in the fact that actually sometimes the outcome is not the way in which you would like it to be, and that, in a way, you're absolutely right, creates a trauma response, because there's a difference between the fantasy expectation and the reality of the lived experience. So I agree with you. I think a second layer to that is the fact that actually there is an increasing narrative in terms of the fact that, well, if something is not right, then therefore somebody must be responsible for it, and therefore there's an attribution of blame, in that sense, and often the way in which political systems work is about trying to deflect that, is to try to minimize that as a lived experience. That's why it goes back to that diagram I showed you between what the individual response is and what the political systemic responses are. And they can be very, very different, sadly, but they can be very, very different. I think the third bit, which again links in with what you're saying, is the fact that, in a way, what I'm saying is that we have to widen our language of trauma. One of the problems with PTSD and complex PTSD is that it's ultimately very reductionist. Complex PTSD focuses on 6 clusters of symptoms, and everything I've been talking about actually doesn't often fit those 6 clusters. So actually starting to view the fact that actually trauma probably only explains part of this is a critical part of trying to change the narrative within that. I think the fourth bit is that in itself also creates a dilemma, because am I saying that moral injury is another form of mental illness, or actually should we not be going down that road, in terms of pathologizing it in that particular way? And actually what you'll find in the literature is it's going in both directions. So particularly within the military veterans field, it's very much wanting to work towards moral injury becoming a new diagnosis for DSM-6, if we ever get that. And then you get others that say, look, no, we should not be going down that road at all, because actually that then starts to pathologize some of these normal, lived experience concerns that people have. So an example would be grief. Is grief a pathological condition or not? When actually grief is something that we all experience sort of, all of the time. So we have to acknowledge in terms of the fact that, well, no, grief is fundamentally part of our lived experience. It's just that sometimes when people maybe don't grieve in a certain way, it can start to create problems later on down the line. It can be exactly the same with regards to some of these moral dimensions. Does that answer it over? I think I've missed a bit around the.
Yes, it's partially answered it, but the parent who spends 2, 4, 8, 20 weeks in the
Yeah.
not knowing if the child is
Yeah.
going to survive, and not knowing if they're going to survive cognitively, physically, emotionally intact.
Yeah.
Can we stop that from going to trauma?
Empirically, we don't have enough evidence to support the fact that actually that yes, it can. But I think understanding it early enough, offering choices about ways in which you could probably deal with it or not deal with it is absolutely critical. Is absolutely critical, because actually what you do is you run the risk of preventing the chaos later on down the line. In that sense. Your broader question is about the research evidence base around the robustness around early trauma interventions. And that's where it gets a little bit nefarious, really, because actually we don't have enough evidence to support what actually is the best intervention, you know, in that sense. We had a very bizarre experience with the Red Cross about 5 years ago, where we were invited to their headquarters in Geneva, and one of the questions they asked us was, can early intervention EMDR prevent PTSD? And the honest answer, and the honest answer is that we think it does. And his reply was, well, come back when you know. And now that really pissed me off at the time, but actually he was right. He was right. Now I think we're in a stronger position now. We are in a stronger position, but I think if you look at some of the work that's going on in the Middle East around early interventions, they're not about doing trauma interventions. They're about doing simple things well. Doing simple things well by getting communities together, by part of shared lived experiences. Really, in that sense. Yeah. Oh.
I have a daughter who has got a very rare brain disorder called Carrie syndrome, and everybody wants to fix her.
Yeah.
But it can't be fixed.
Yeah.
And living with that, now she's coming 39 now, and living with that, and you can't sense that into people.
Yeah.
She can't be fixed.
Yeah.
But again, when you go back to the very beginning, and you think of when she was born, just what you were saying. And would I think that was trauma? No. Would I think any of that? No. But now when I look back on my life, yes.
Yeah.
And it's all the things that are put in place to actually live life. You know, people talk about, you know, PSD, the war, everything. I grew up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Did anybody ever talk to me about the Troubles in Northern Ireland? I remember having this tiny, tiny wee baby in the Royal Victoria Hospital. I lived a good number of miles away from, from it, and I was going to Belfast with this tiny, tiny baby that was so sick. And while you were going in through the hospital doors, there was bombs going off and shooting. And it was only like about 6 weeks ago or whatever, when I was talking to one of the people from Wales, that all of that started to come back to me. Was that ever discussed? No. Was any of the whole diagnosis, anything ever discussed? No. And in that whole 39 years, I have fought a system that is so badly broken, who blames me because I had this baby, you know, and it's only now when you think about it, and I did do EMDR for a few things. It did fix some of it, but some of it didn't fix. But I think the big thing we have to get over is naming things. We are continuously thinking, that's a box, get it in there. That, you know, we have to continue doing that. And we forget to actually talk to people. You know, and I think the big thing of it all is acceptance. And when families accept it, I think professionals need to accept it. You know, every time I go to hospital, I'd be like, oh, I can't believe I've gone here. I would do anything than take my daughter to hospital. And people would be like, you don't mean that. And I said, no, but you have no idea. I because I'm going to go in here and these people are going to try and fix her. And I keep telling them, you can't fix it. That it is not, she's not broken, but you can't fix it.
Yeah.
But that's another thing that professionals believe. They have to fix everything. Sometimes they just don't allow people to experience the pain, experience everything, and then try and come out the other end.
Yeah.
You know, and that for me is where we're losing so much. That's to me, we lost so much, and you know, and I think as you get older, now that I'm getting older, I'm on the wrong side of 50 now. So I'm closer to 60. But I'm closer to 60. So I'm that's my friend. That's my friend, you know. But you know, like when I think about it, am I going to get another 30 years? Likely not.
Yeah.
And then I think to myself, will my daughter get another 30 years? Likely not, or she may do. But it's everything that you miss out in life and the stuff that piles up. And one of the things you said, which was very interesting, sorry I'm hogging this, was you said, you know, would you tell your story to everybody? In my life and Maria's life, we have to tell our story just to get services. And there's times you don't want to tell them. You just do not. Like when I was going through, and I don't even know I'm going to say this, but I'm going to say it now. I went through an awful terrible time with really, really bad anxiety, and I know Derek knows about it and a few other people in the room. Did I want to tell the people who provide services to my daughter? No. Why? Because then people would judge me. Because I knew I could talk to Derek and talk to other people here in the School of Nursing, because I know they wouldn't judge me. But the people I needed to talk to actually help me, I couldn't, because I was like, they'll judge me, which is terrible.
No, listen, thank you for sharing all that. That's very beautifully put, actually, because I think in a way that really connects with what I was trying to say, you know, which is this notion about the fact that it's about taking away some of that pressure of full disclosure, you know, in that sense, and normalizing that more, very much in the way that you said. I think the second bit is this notion about the fact that actually sometimes trauma is not fixable. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of services that are set up, you know, and we even see that within EMDR, when new recruits are saying, oh, I need to be getting to the point where I'm doing this bit, because then I'm feeling like I'm helping the client. No, that's just one part of it, you know, but we always say trauma changes people. And actually, you can sometimes never go back to the way it was before. So surviving trauma is always about reinvention. It's in whatever way that is. And I think you're absolutely right. It should always be individuals that define that, and not services, really, in that sense. Yes, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Yeah, Mom.
I also have a disabled son, and one is very severely disabled.
Right.
And has a rare neurological genetic disorder. And a group of us came together around, you know, basically services to do with disability 21 years ago. And it was just something you said about doing simple things right, because, you know, all of the women in that group, the core group, we still are together, we still communicate on a daily basis. Those people have come through some serious troubles, related trauma from childhood. It's trauma heaped on top of trauma. On top of trauma. Probably if we told the story, she wouldn't believe it, because it's so awful what some people have been through. But life is a battle, and they basically all have very severely complex health. Children, well, they're not children, they're adults. We still call them children because they are our children. But for us, we've all been through different types of interventions. But for us, it's the simple things that keep us ticking every day. It's that communication with each other every day. It's just being present for each other, you know. So I think it's what Mary said, everybody tries to think we have to look at the complexity of this, look at the simplicity of it. Look what works for people, and we'll not hog it anymore.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. If we just share you one very small story of probably one of the most surreal experiences I've probably had in my professional career. It was in Iraq. We're in a IDP camp with Yazidi survivors, and walked into the clinic, and there was a group of 8 women, and they were killing themselves laughing. They were absolutely, they've just had the most awful experiences. Awful. They've been rescued by military. They were now safe in the camps, and they were all laughing hysterically. And I obviously couldn't understand, Sarani. So I asked the translator, what are they laughing at? And she said, "Oh, I don't want to tell you because it's embarrassing." And so I thought, oh, now I'm even more intrigued. Okay, what are they laughing at? And she said, now again, within the Yazidi faith, it's very hierarchical. Men have very high status. Anyway, one of the women had disclosed in this as we were sharing tea, the noise her husband makes when he farts. And so they all started to laugh at this. And she said, and one of them must have said, okay, what does this sound like? And she said, well, it sounds a little bit like, they all burst out laughing. And then that started this narrative of, well, when my husband does it, it sounds more like, no type of thing really. But there were connections going on there. There were healings going on. There was almost like giving voice to something that we don't talk about. No, we don't. You know, just to say, is that a therapeutic intervention would be to overcomplicate it. You know, no, in that sense. But what it is about doing, it's about bringing people together, bringing communities together, bringing that sense of that shared compassion, that shared humanity. You're absolutely right. Sometimes we can't fix it, but the mistake is assuming that we can fix everything. We can't. The nature of the randomness of the lived experience is the fact that sometimes, you know, the outcomes are not what we want them to be. And so you're absolutely right. We have to view that with compassion. We have to view that with greater degrees of acceptance. And we have to find other ways of finding the beauty of moving forward with that. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Sir.
My name is Farrell. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University.
Nice to meet you.
Nursing school. Actually, when we talk about MBE therapy, what it comes to my mind, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's very valuable to me. When we talk about the MBE therapy, it comes to me the technology. Now, in our life or in our century, we couldn't separate anything from the technology. What is the role of the technology within MBE therapy?
Within the role of technology, well, okay, very, very briefly. I think the COVID pandemic has changed that really quite dramatically. There's been a big explosion in virtual therapy. And I think, you know, some of the research that, you know, Paul, myself, Derek, Ian have been involved in is really testing out the efficacy of that. Is it safe? Is it effective? Is it relevant? Is it, in that sense, there's a lot of increasing evidence to suggest that it does. But what we also know is that there is lots of evidence to show that for some people, they won't go anywhere near it, you know, in that sense. And so I think we've learned a lot more in the last 2-3 years than we did before, and I think that's useful. That's useful. I think the second area where I think technology can be extraordinarily helpful is, if I can make a bold prediction as to where I think trauma work is going to go in the future, it will go towards intensive working. You know, because I think it'll be the economies of scale of that are going to be very, very significant, and I think in order to do intensive trauma work, I think technology is going to play a very, very vital part of that. I think the third bit is, I think some of the technologies that I think we need in clinical practice, we don't have yet. In that sense. And so, but I think some of the developments around things like psychedelics, some of the things around sort of getting better insights into how we can use heart rate variability, you know, during processing, so technology can have a part to play. However, You can have the best technology in the world, but it's still about a relational experience. You know, and we have an expression in Liverpool which says it's all in the way you hold your mouth. Okay, so basically means is the fact that actually that client needs to absolutely feel that you are authentically willing to journey with them. And actually technology won't play a part in that. Is that okay, sir?